Good. All right. So yeah, for first of all, 2020.1.4 is available now. If you go to our downloads page, you can get it and have the latest and greatest Octopus deploy. We are going to talk about our new release strategy, changes to how we're doing our feature releases. And along with that, some new minimum requirements. We'll talk about some new options for you to use the Octopus CLI on various platforms, including Windows, Mac, and Linux. Bob's going to jump in and do a demo of some of the features that were added in this 2020.1 release, some enhancements to worker pools and support of our AWS and Azure infrastructure as code steps. And at the end, we'll have a brief overview of some lessons learned from the engineering team porting Octopus Deploy to .NET Core 3.1. So I mentioned a new release strategy. And Bob, you know this, and some of the people joining into this webinar will also know that in late 2018, we added this concept of long-term support releases.
Yep.
So we have this concept, we do like a monthly release usually that had a new feature or some feature enhancements. But once a quarter, we started rolling those feature releases up into a long-term support, something that was stable, that you could move to and have critical bug patches and security patches for 6 months after its release. So if you're on a more conservative upgrade model, you don't want to upgrade to a new version of Octopus every month, you could upgrade to the long-term support and know that you would be supported for 6 months. We're changing that a little bit this year. We are going to do 6 feature releases, 2020.1 being the first one. And every feature release we do will have critical patches for 6 months. So essentially every feature release is going to be an LTS release. There's no longer going to be a fast lane as what we called our monthly releases. So that's good. So less decision to make when you go to the download page. I think it's not updated yet, but probably either this evening or sometime this week, there will only be one download for Octopus Server, which is the current version. You won't choose Fastlane or LTS.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like this image that we have. It kind of really shows how it's going to work and how it looks.
Yes. So yeah, if you look in the blog post, and this is something we'll link to that announces this change. So the first one, 2020.1 is coming in March, and then it's going to be, the initial rollout is to cloud instances. So that's a good thing to point out. I mentioned that 2020.1.4 is available for download now. Usually that would have been a .0 release. The .0 releases are going to our Octopus cloud instances first. We're going to do testing internally and then on our cloud instances, and we'll have a few patches. And once we're happy with it and it's stable, then you'll have a release to the self-hosted customers, and that'll be available on the download page, and it'll receive patches through September, this one specifically. And then sometime in late April, May, you'll see our second feature release that will be supported through mid-November.
Cool.
Now with 2020.1, we also have new Octopus Server minimum requirements. And I do want to stress this is not for your deployment targets. This is for hosting the Octopus Server itself. The Octopus Server needs to run on Windows Server 2012 R2 or later. And your Octopus Server database needs to be hosted on SQL Server 2017 or later. And along with these changes, we're also ending mainstream support for IE11. So any IE11 specific bugs or UI issues will not be patched.
But it should continue to work with IE11, but we're not going to explicitly target it. Is that right? So if it happens, like the UI is not going to just suddenly stop loading on the page all of a sudden.
No, it won't. It won't stop loading, but if there's any issues or anything, it's not something that we're supporting explicitly.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got the options listed here, but I think it's better, Bob, if you show the downloads page. If you come to our downloads page, you'll notice if you click on the CLI option, download the Octopus CLI. If you're on Windows, you can, of course, continue to use Chocolatey to install the Octopus tools. But see we have tabs for Mac, Linux, and Docker. So on Mac, you can now install the Octopus CLI with Homebrew. With Linux, depending on your distro, you can use apt or yum to install the Octopus CLI. And we've had this for a while, but it's also listed here. There's also a Docker container, Octopus Deploy /Octo, that you can use to run Octopus CLI commands from this Docker container. So you don't even need to install the tools. If you have Docker, you can run this Docker image and run an Octopus CLI command against it. And we still have the option to download the previous .NET Core 2.0 version of the CLI if you need to use that.
Oh, that's weird. Okay.
All right, Bob, I'm going to let you jump in and talk about some of our product changes, and then I believe the demo, right?
Yep, absolutely. So I want to talk to everyone a little bit about some of the changes that we've made for 2020.1. We've added dark mode. I'm not really going to talk about that. I think just a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'll just show it, and the entire demo will be done in dark mode. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the AWS Azure cross-platform steps. So one of the reasons why we are upping our minimum requirements for the Windows Server side is because now Octopus Deploy is running in .NET Core 3.1. Now, part of that is so we can support cross-platform, so we can support both Windows and Linux. And our goal ultimately is to release something where you can run Octopus Server on Linux. Well, right now, a big chunk of our steps still require a Windows worker. So it's not really a super great story. So we're taking the first steps in making AWS and Azure have those types of steps they can run on now. They can now run on either Linux or Windows. And then we've also made a couple of improvements to runbooks. Namely, there's a new step template out there that I think is really useful for a lot of people. And then finally, we added a worker pool variable type. And this, to me, really opens up what workers can do. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about workers before we kind of jump into the demonstration, because I think it's really important for all of us to kind of have a basic understanding of how workers work. I'm sure there's some of you out there that they know how they work, and you're like, yeah, this is going to be a repeat. But I just want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. All right, Ryan, quick question for you. When you had to deploy to something like a database, how did you handle it? Did you have Octopus Deploy basically extract the packages right on the server and then run those scripts on the database?
Yeah, that's how I originally had it set up. I installed a tentacle on my database server and just had it deploy the database scripts and run them locally there connecting to the database. Found out later that's probably not a best practice. So I've changed, but that was my first attempt back in the day.
And it doesn't work so well for platform as a service like Azure SQL or AWS RDS type databases.
Oh, well, I had different problems back when I was doing this. I didn't have cloud database problems.
Yeah. The way that I did it was we used what was known as a jump box. And so that sat between Octopus Deploy and the database. And what that let us do is a couple of things. Is we reduced the latency. As you can see here, I have my Octopus Deploy server sitting in my home office in Omaha. And then we have another one, then I have my database sitting in the South Central US region. Well, with that jump box, it's running a tentacle and I'm extracting my package on that jump box, and then I'm connecting to the database directly from there. So hopefully latency is a lot less. I also don't have to open up port 1433 outside of my data center, which is also nice. It's like security performance. It's security boost as well. And that works out pretty well because you can have this scale out a little bit, but taking a look at this diagram, Ryan, what are your thoughts? Do you see any problems with this at all?
What comes to mind immediately is potentially if you had multiple network segments, multiple regions, you would need multiple jump boxes, and that could get confusing depending on how you're doing that. If you had two jump boxes and it's a deployment target, it can get sticky with the roles and how it gets deployed to.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because a jump box is running a tentacle. It's a target in a sense. The other thing that I kind of noticed was you're going to run into the mutex a little bit unless you disable that.
That's true. You can only run, yeah, unless you disable that mutex, that Gembox can only run one deployment task at a time. So if you have a lot of database deployments happening at one time, you'll end up seeing some queuing.
Oh yeah. And then what happens if, in this case, if that jump box goes down, I basically stopped all my database deployments then.
Yeah, that would probably be a panic moment for some people.
Oh yeah. For whatever reason, it could go down. Oh, I just need to install some patches. Oh my gosh, we stopped all deployments. And that's what workers were designed to do, was to solve that particular problem, or those two particular use cases. Workers out of the box don't have a mutex enabled, so you can run as multiple, as many concurrent deployments as you want on any given worker. But then you can also put them into a pool. So a pool can have 1 to n number of workers. And how that works is it will lease the worker out of the pool, do the work, and then add it back into the pool when it's done. And it solved those two use cases, I thought, really, really well. But there's a small little use case that it didn't work out so great. And I'm going to throw a monkey wrench at you, Ryan. So right now I have Project A, Project B, and Project C as my database. What happens when I switch that up to different environments like this? And I want to have essentially a different worker pool per environment.
Yeah, so right now there is a way to do that in Octopus, but it's a little hard to find.
That's right.
But yeah, you would essentially want a different worker pool per environment.
Yeah, especially if you're doing what you're talking about with network segmentation, and you say these 2 VMs or 3 VMs, they're the only ones that have access to this test database, or these 3 VMs only have access to these production databases. And with V1, you get around that by using cloud regions. Have you had a chance to set those up before?
I did, because I believe I had a customer ask me this specific question, and I went to the engineering team and they clued me in on a field that was added to cloud regions that I wasn't aware was there.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to discover as well. I didn't know about that until I think either you or somebody else pointed that out. I was like, just use cloud regions. And when they first said that, I thought they were just messing with me at first. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense.
That is a practical joke I like to play, is giving you false features.
Now, one of the downsides of the cloud region is it's hard to discover. Most people don't know it's there unless you happen to read our knowledge base article. And then it's also hard to use because you have to set everything just so for non-target steps, because a region is a target. You assign it an environment and you assign it a role. But a number of steps that we provide, such as run CloudFormation, deploy to Kubernetes, ARM templates, and Terraform, it expects a worker. And so you have to do a number of different things just to hopefully get everything working just right. So it's harder for people to use. And what we really want to do is just have something like this, where you just have a dev worker pool and I want to deploy to a dev database. And I have a test worker pool and it goes to a test database in production and so on. That's really kind of the idea. And that's really where that worker pool variable type came about. So now what you can do is you can go in and you can define a variable in your project or in a variable set and assign it a worker pool variable type. And you can then scope that variable to whatever environment. It could be an environment, it could be a channel, it could be a tenant. And we'll kind of walk through that as part of this demonstration as well.
Yeah, I like that. I could see, besides just environments, it could be very useful to have just separate worker pools for specific steps in some cases, and being able to scope to the step, or having, split out, maybe your run books use a different worker pool than your deployment process for some reason.
Yeah, I could see a use case for a bunch of those. Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, so I set up my demonstration to kind of mimic what you were talking about a little earlier, Ryan, where I have the network segmented. So the dev database only accepts connections from a specific subnet, and I have my workers sitting in that subnet. Same thing with test and the VMs for the test worker pool. But then I also had another scenario where, since I'm in Omaha, the central US region is the closest one to me. So for my test environment, I want that. It makes a lot of sense. push that out there. Hopefully my latency is pretty low. But in staging, I might have all my beta testers, they might be closer to the north central US, whereas in production, for whatever reason, it's closer to the south central US region. So you can kind of have those different types of regions as well as different subnets, and however you want to have it, you can divide it up this way. So that's kind of how I did that. All right, so let's kick it off to the demo to kind of walk through some of this. All right, so what I have set up is I have 4 worker pools. But before I get started, it's a little bright, don't you think, Ryan?
It is very bright. I've got my shades on, man.
I'm gonna go ahead and click on my name, and I'm just gonna enable the dark theme.
Much better, yes.
Yeah, a lot easier to see. All right, so I have my 4 worker pools, 1 per environment. I'm having a little bit of problem spinning up test and staging for whatever reason. It's just not agreeing with me today. I rolled the Azure IAC dice and decided to come up snake eyes. But what I did, I'm sorry.
I was going to say 2 out of 4 ain't bad, huh?
But what I did is I set up those cloud regions like we were talking about. I wanted to show people, if they don't upgrade yet to 2020.1 for a variety of reasons, you can still have a worker pool per environment by using cloud regions. And you have it, you assign it to an environment, you assign it a role, and then this is where you assign it that particular worker pool. And that's how you define the worker pool for the environment. Most people, they don't really see the cloud regions. So when I go in and add another, I have Windows, Linux, Mac, Azure, Kubernetes. It's all the way over here. And you wouldn't think about that, but it is right there. And it's a pretty basic target. There's not a whole lot going on with it.
Yeah, and there's that new field that was added at the bottom. You can choose a default worker pool for this cloud target, this cloud region target.
Yep.
So that was the old way of getting it wasn't necessarily a variable, but you could have a target that used a specific worker pool.
Yep, absolutely. So what it looked like was, is in my cloud region, my process, it was targeting. I would run a step and I'd target that. So db up sample. And it worked out pretty well, I thought. But again, if you wanted to add a step to use that cloud region, it got a little funky. So if I did something like this and I said, hey, I want to run a CloudFormation step for whatever reason, you had to come in here and you say, I want to run this. And then you kind of have to set it up just so, and then you have to set it up. So it's like a bunch of different things that you have to do, and it'd work okay. I'm gonna go ahead and discard these changes. But how it works right now, I'm just gonna kick off a quick release. As we can see pretty quickly, hopefully, that it will acquire the packages, and it should see the new. Yep. So it does see that worker. That D is my prefix for development. So DB work win. So I pick that up. But what we wanted to solve is we wanted to make that a lot easier so you didn't have to use cloud regions. And that's where this worker pool variable type came into play. So now, if you were to select, so this is just a basic variable, but you can come in here, you can change the type, and you can change that to worker pool. But once you set it to worker pool, I'm gonna click out of that real quick, a new modal window will appear when you click on that, and then you can go ahead and you can select that particular worker pool that you want to use. What I really like is this define scope, because you can define it, you can scope it to 1 to n number of environments. And with runbooks, now, Ryan, did you know about this? Is that you can scope a variable to a specific runbook.
I did, but I found out about it way too late.
After the runbooks webinar.
Yeah, I missed it in the initial release. So, but I know now.
And you can also scope it to specific channels. So maybe, like you said, you can target a runbook for a particular channel. So you have that type of functionality as well.
Could be useful too. This isn't a multi-tenant project, but scoping it to a tenant tag may have some uses too. If you have like certain customers that are in a region, you want to use a worker pool closer to their region.
That's a really good point. I'm actually going to show that in just a little bit.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So my process now, go ahead and scroll back up. Now it's running off of a worker pool. So I say select a worker, run once on a worker, and then instead of runs on a worker from a specific worker pool, there's a new option that says, I just want to do this, and it will automatically filter out all the variables available to this project and select just the worker pool variable types. So I only have one. And then what this looks like is I'll go ahead and create a release, and it will look exactly the same as the other release I just did. It's still going to pick up the exact same worker, but now it's dynamically picking the worker pool based off of the actual worker pool variable type as opposed to a cloud region. And we can click on that and we can see, yep, DB work when. Now, what I really like about this is this variable type, like we said, is not just limited to a deployment process. You can also leverage this in runbooks. And for those of you that are not familiar with runbooks, this is a new feature we added in our last LTS release. And this will allow you to have a series of steps similar to a deployment process. I don't want to delete anything. I want to spin it up. Similar to a deployment process, I give it the steps. I want to, just like everything else, but I want to run this, I can just select an environment, and I don't have to go through dev, test, or staging. I can just go ahead and kick this off right now. And my process is using the same exact thing. So for the check database existence, it will use that worker pool variable type. So you can see right here, it's going to be running on a worker. If I go ahead and click on the raw log, because sometimes the lease information doesn't show up, is you can see I'm leasing the worker P work when from that pool, and it just uses the exact same variable type as well. So it definitely opens up quite a bit as to what you can and can't do. And I added one additional step into my process to help kind of hopefully make everything really more powerful. So I have a new run a runbook step template that we created. So I can run a spin up Azure SQL Server database runbook. So we'll run this as part of my deployment process, and I'll go ahead and kick it off, but it's only going to run it for my feature branches. So for example, if I wanted to spin up some infrastructure, when I detected the feature branches channel, it will allow me to do something like that. I'm still dog fooding it a little bit, so it's going to be hopefully get a little bit better. I added the cancel functionality in yesterday, but it just uses the API to kick everything off.
Oh, but why would you need a cancel functionality, Bob?
Because I had a runbook that's taking forever to run right now. The spin up workers and test, it's taking over an hour to run. Nothing good is going to come from this. So I'm going to have to go ahead and cancel this if this doesn't come back online in the next by the end of this webinar. So you don't want to just have something sitting out there consuming all your tasks until the end of time.
Yeah, but this is handy though, because some people may choose to have their infrastructure as code steps in their deployment process. Some may choose to have it in a run book, but you can also do it in both. You can have it to wherever you want to spin up stuff ad hoc. Run books are perfect, but you also want to make sure it's there when you're doing a deployment, especially the dev or test. Mm-hmm. Then you can have it in both places. And this step template lets you do that without really duplicating like the same number of steps in both places.
Yeah. And you can also do something like this, which is a bit crazy. I have a run book called Unleash the Kraken that has all the steps. So it's going to spin up everything that's needed for this space. And it's just using run book throughout my different projects. So I can kind of control this a little bit better. As compared to before, I could do a scheduled trigger and say, go ahead and spin up, production, staging, test, all those workers, but it'd spin up all 4 tasks all concurrently. I'm like, no, I want to do it one at a time, so I don't just flood my Octopus server with that.
I was going to ask if this is why all of my tasks are being queued right now.
No, not anymore. This only runs at most 2 tasks at a given point. Yours is probably getting queued by other people.
Okay.
But we did want to also show those the AWS steps. And we also talked a little bit about the different regions. So I have another application set up. And Ryan, did you know this with AWS, that each region is pretty much segmented?
Yes, I think the first time I learned that is when I sadly found out I couldn't use the same what is it? Is it the AMI ID?
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't use the same ID in my CloudFormation step across multiple regions.
Yeah. So I have 3 different regions, California, Ohio, and Oregon, set up. And then what I did is I created a tenant tag associated with those regions. And the reason I did that is because then I could create a variable set, like you said before, and I could come in here and I could scope different variables to different regions. Like my AMIs, your SSH key pairs are going to be different for each one, subnets, security groups, all kinds of fun stuff. But then you can also have different workers, just like I did right here. So I thought that, I was like, oh, that's really handy now with that worker pool variable type. Because the way I have it set up is I have an S3 bucket, and that exists in California. And I think I have that it might be locked down, so only VMs from that region can upload to the S3 bucket. I know it is locked down, so you have to have a certain role, but I'm pretty sure I have it locked down for that region as well. In my project itself, getting back to using the runbooks example, I can spin up and down that infrastructure. And what's really cool about this is if I click on process, I'm running a make Ubuntu instance CloudFormation template, but I'm using my Linux worker pool to do this for me. I didn't have to change anything at all. I have to change anything with this particular CloudFormation template. It's the exact same one that I use in my workers project. I just changed a few minor things in here as to what functionality I wanted to add. So I just added in Nginx and .NET Core 3.1 for this particular project. That's the only thing that I've changed. Everything else is the exact same between the two.
Yeah, that's nice. So yeah, everything's parameterized, and even the worker run zone, so you can really have it like suited to work in specific regions for you.
Mm-hmm. I did also want to point this out in case anyone is thinking about doing something like this with their runbooks, is with this particular runbook, it is multi-tenantized. So when I want to spin up and tear down things, I have my test environment in Ohio, but I wanted to have my production environment split across 3 regions. So you can see I have those 3 different tenants set up, and I can come into my settings and I can say in multi-tenancy, the runbook must run against a tenant. But in the project, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, would it? So I just want to deploy to test. I just want to deploy to production. I don't want to do some sort of rolling deployment in this particular example. Maybe you do. I'm not going to argue, because I could see definitely use cases for that, but I could go ahead and I can click on the settings and I can change this project level to disable tenanted deployment. So runbook and the project, they can have different settings for those tenants. So I didn't know about that when I started playing around with runbooks for the first time. And I kind of stumbled upon this just by accident. So I just wanted to point it out so everyone can kind of learn from that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I could think of a few use cases where you'd want runbooks to be opposite from your deployment process. Maybe you deploy to tenants, but you have runbooks that are generic, and you just want to run them on all your targets, not specific to a tenant.
Oh, that's a really good point. If you needed to do any sort of maintenance, so
Yeah.
installing the latest version of .NET Core for whatever reason. All right, cool. That is about the extent of the demo. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Ryan.
Sounds good. Thanks for that demo. Yeah, the new features are really great, and especially dark mode. There's some excitement in the chat for dark mode I saw.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool.
All right, and finally, before we get into the Q&A, this is coming from a blog post that's going to be published soon, I think in the next day or two. But part of all this work, and Bob's kind of alluded to it, is a lot of this came from us porting Octopus Server itself to .NET Core 3.1. So the team has written a blog post on some of the benefits of why we did this and what we got out of it, along with some kind of lessons learned, specific areas that hurdles we faced or just information we found out while doing this port. So I'm going to just kind of give a high level overview of that, but the real details will be in that blog post, which we'll include in the email that goes out. So there are multiple benefits to porting to .NET Core 3.1, keeping your code base on a modern framework, being able to use modern tools, like all of that stuff is just good in general. But I think the biggest thing, and Bob, I hope you agree, we'll see, is being able to host Octopus on Linux. That was really a big game changer for our cloud-hosted environment, and hopefully being able to release that into the future for others to be able to host on Linux as well.
Yeah, being able to, I think it was really being able to host it in that Linux-based container versus a Windows-based container. That was one of the big drivers behind kicking off this whole process.
Yeah. As far as some of the hurdles they faced, some big ones were platform-specific differences. Bob, I don't know if you know this, but Windows and Linux are very different.
Get out of town.
We had some information stored in the Windows registry that had to be moved to either the file system or to the database itself. We've run into some database performance issues. Bob, I think this is one of your favorite topics, or maybe your least favorite, Mars.
Yeah, it's an interesting use case. And yeah, we could talk about that for a bit, but yeah, if I recall correctly, the .NET Core SQL library didn't like Mars nearly as well on Linux as it does on Windows.
Right, and Mars is a setting which is multiple active result sets, so
yep.
MARS, which caused some performance issues on Linux, but that were not there on Windows, which is interesting. And of course, there were a few issues with Windows authentication, which the team had to work around, and they came up with an interesting solution for that. On testing and debugging .NET Core on Linux and Docker, this is more just kind of like, I think, tips for what made our test work better. For example, they found that to avoid any permission issues, it's better to run the server with non-root access. So avoid any like issues with the file system or permissions. One of the problems we ran into there was that the Octopus server, all the info gets actually stored in /etc/octopus on Linux, which is root privilege. You have to usually have root privileges in there. So for testing, they would actually change the owner of that specific folder to the test user.
Oh, wow.
We've got certificates self-signed certificates that we use for our end-to-end test, which were PFX files, which we have a script in the blog post that converts those to the format supported on Linux and also adds them to the Linux certificate store to make the test run. And another interesting database performance thing was we found that the end-to-end test run a lot faster if database connection pooling was turned off.
That's completely counterintuitive to all my other testing. That's funny.
I know, yeah. So that was an interesting thing, but I think they're still working on trying to find the root cause, but for now that has been disabled for the test. The test run faster.
Huh.
And finally, just some things we found out about shipping self-contained packages. So one big benefit of this is reduced installation requirements. Now, if you're installing Octopus Server, it's a self-contained package. You don't need to install the .NET Core framework ahead of time. So it makes the installation simpler for users and also for us to support. One of the, what?
I'm saying, yeah, that was one of the biggest problems I recall is like, okay, what version of .NET Framework do I need to install on this Windows server? So I'm actually really excited about that. That's one less thing I have to worry about.
Yeah, you don't have to give up at some point and just install all of them.
Yeah, I might have done at some point.
One of the drawbacks to self-contained packages is that that is one of the reasons we did drop support for the older systems. They're not supported on the older operating systems, but we made the decision to move forward as a product to be able to stay modern and up to date and to continue to innovate on new features. We had to make that trade-off. Can't support the older systems, but we can move forward and support actually a wider footprint of systems now. But again,
it's just not Windows.
Yeah.
Like older versions of Windows, but now we can support stuff like Ubuntu and Red Hat and everything.
Yeah, Linux distros.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So like I said, these were the highlights. The blog post, we'll link to it. It's coming. It's got way more details in it for especially the example scripts around the certificates and the details around the authentication. We'll include those. Let's jump ahead and talk about some new resources that have been added and a few old ones. So as usual, if you have any questions on how to use Octopus, what's the best way to do something, questions about a new feature, you can email advice@octopus.com. Somebody from our team will pick that up and will help you get the answer you need. But for some new things, and one of these is semi-old, but I don't know if we've ever really announced it very much, and that's the end-to-end guides. Bob, can you pull that up?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if you go to our docs, there is octopus.com/docs/guides. You can create a end-to-end tutorial, and these are dynamically generated. We have about 100 of them in the system now with plans to expand them out. So if you're using Java with Git on Jenkins, deploying to Tomcat, there is a guide you can generate that has some videos that walks you through how to set each piece up, talks about how that solution works, and gives you a guide to get started. Now, to piggyback on that, Bob, if you go a little bit, if you go back to the tutorial, because there was a link, there was a link there, test drive VMs. So this is the new thing that we have, and these are VMs that are already configured and set up that you can download and install and start running. An example of, for example, Kubernetes and Java, which is the current tab. So if you're new to Octopus or you want to see how specifically Kubernetes and Java would work or Nginx and Node would work, you can download these virtual machines and spin them up, give them a test drive.
Nice. Yeah, that's always nice because I always ran into, I need to spin up a couple of those VMs just to test a few things out. I'm probably just going to use this just for demos, to be honest.
Yeah, I would perfect for demos. Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the product roadmap, so we do have, I don't believe it's updated yet, but we do have the roadmap page, octopus.com/roadmap, which should show, so it's not up to date. The update should be coming this week. You'll see dark mode kind of fall to the bottom. It's been updated. It's out there, CLI on Homebrew. All of those will be moving. And then I think there will be some new entries on there as well.
Yep. And then I know the Terraform provider is moving along. I just saw some chatter in our Slack, our company Slack. So hopefully it's still being worked on. It's just slow and steady. It's kind of moving. It's kind of winning the race on that one.
Yeah, if you scroll down a little bit too, for each of these items, there is a little blurb paragraph for them, and there's a button for keep me updated. So if you see any of these that you're specifically interested in, you can click the keep me updated.
Oh.
You got to go to Octopus ID.
Oh, that's interesting.
But yeah, if you do that, then you'll be updated whenever there's news about it shipping.
Oh, we'll have to fix that.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think somebody put that in chat too. The Terraform link does not work. So.
Oops. Well, we will get that fixed. I'll let everyone else know.
Yeah, chat with Rob afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump back. Let's go into, I think Q&A is next. All right, yep. Q&A. So we got some questions, Bob. And one is specifically about IAM roles for cross-account deployment. Do we support it?
Cross-account deployment for the IAM roles as opposed to using just an AWS account. Is that what you're thinking about?
I think that's the question.
I don't believe that's something that we support at this time, but there's been some chatter between us and our product team about adding some support for that, but that's about as far as it's gotten.
You can choose to use the role on the if your target or your workers in EC2 instance, you can choose to use that role, correct?
Yeah, and that's actually what I ran into that trying to upload to S3. I didn't have a role assigned to the EC2 instance. And so it wouldn't let me upload to S3 at all. It says I can't find this role. So the worker itself, you could use the role associated with that.
All right, and this is a question on running. So yeah, it says you cannot run deployment steps on worker nodes if you have SQL files that are run through PowerShell. You need to extract the package from your build server and then run the SQL files. Same goes for DACPack files. So yeah, so that's right. You can't run deployment steps on workers, but along with workers, and maybe it was also in the, or maybe it came out with the Kubernetes release, the script steps have been revamped. So you won't necessarily use a deployment step for your database packages with workers. You would use a script step with reference packages.
Yep, and I have that set up. And I'm going to open up this space once we're done with this particular webinar. But inside my process, I have a generate delta report, and this is using a package reference. And so what this will do is this extracts the package, and then you can do the necessary work on that. So one of the variables that it gives is package path. I'll just scroll over to the right on this. And you can see, and it's also provided as one of the many variables that we include.
Yeah, so it does change now. I know we were updating some of the community step templates to support this with workers. I don't know if the DACPack ones were updated or not.
I don't believe so, not yet. Same thing with the Redgate one. So right now the Redgate ones still rely on, you have to extract the package, has to put it in a path. I think what we'll probably do is, which would make sense, would be probably have another step template that supports workers in that sense.
Yeah, I know there are a few of them that we have dual support. There's one that will run as a like on a deployment target, and there's a few that have been updated to also support workers. Yeah, so if you're using the community step templates for DACPacks, yeah, probably not support this setup, but you could clone that step template and modify it to be to work with the worker.
Yeah, and then one thing I did run into, especially on this one, believe it or not, was so it would actually, for this step, it would actually nuke the entire folder, like the extracted path, which was okay. But it did it before the artifact was created. So it was like nuking, I didn't even have the artifact at all. So what I had to do as a workaround at this particular point in time is I actually had to have it as basically I call it a report path, project.html report.location, that it saves those types of things. So if there's something that needs to be saved for future steps, that's one thing that I had to do. So in this case, I dropped it on there. A UNC share would probably be a better solution. But since I only have one worker in the worker pool, I already know that's always going to pick up that particular, it'll always pick up that exact same worker.
Right.
But yeah, that is probably one of the few roadblocks that I ran into.
Dark mode question. Are we considering a high contrast version?
I don't know. I could ask our design team about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know off the top of my head. I was going to see if you knew, but yeah, that's something we can follow up on, but that's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
See, I think we answered that one. Are there containers for worker nodes?
So a worker node is really nothing more than it's nothing more than a tentacle. It's just how it's registered. So if you were to go into, and I wanted to add another worker, it's a Windows, you can do Windows, it's a listening tentacle or a polling tentacle. It's really how it was registered with the Octopus Deploy server. So there is a tentacle container. I believe it's still currently limited to Windows, if I recall correctly. That is one of the things I think we're still talking about, what's the best approach and how we want to do it with Linux, because the default thing is to say just use Alpine Linux, but is that the right thing that we want to do? So I think we're doing a little bit of research onto something like that.
Yeah, sounds good. You could the run a Docker container step. Is that a script based step?
That is a good question.
Because you could have, if you're looking for a specific container option, if it's a script based step, you could run the container on a worker. It would download the container, run your command, and then clean it up.
There it is. So run. It has to be done on a deployment target. Oh, you'd have to use a cloud region.
Cloud region. Well, you could go to the cloud region and then you set your worker pool to the cloud region. So there's still a use for that yet.
Yeah. Interesting.
Are open metrics / Prometheus metrics endpoints available? If not, are they on the roadmap? They are not available, and I don't think they're on the roadmap. I would say email us advice@octopus.com with what you're looking for there. I'm not familiar with those tools.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of the SQL Server 2017 features being used? Can we still run in SQL Server 2014 but take the risk that is not supported?
It's a good question. So if you've had a chance to dive into the Octopus Deploy database, you'll see that it's a bunch of JSON files for a lot of different things. So for example, the deployment process is saved as a JSON file. What we were running into for some support is we'd have to go in and we'd have to write a script that would say run on SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2012. And because of that, we couldn't use any of the JSON features that were added in SQL Server 2017. So the scripts were really brittle in terms of how it ran. And we did our very, very best to make sure that they're as bulletproof as possible. But with SQL Server 2017 and going forward, we can now leverage those JSON features. So that's one of the big reasons why we just made that decision.
All right. Yeah, I think that is good for questions. If you have any follow-up questions, or if we missed your question and didn't see it, email advice@octopus.com. Again, you're going to get an email with this recording tomorrow. So you could also reply to that email and we'll get it as well. So let's do the outro and then everybody can.
All right.
All right. Oh, so we do have the resources. I dropped some of these in the chat already. These links are going to be in the email, but these are the pages that we hit throughout the demo today or throughout the webinar. Bob, you said you're going to open your sample spaces up to be public to guest access.
Yep.
So we'll include links to those in the email as well. And we will see you next time. We have 2 webinars coming up next week. We have a joint webinar on shipping and monitoring software with Raygun. So it's a joint Octopus Deploy and Raygun webinar. And we have, well, that's not the updated date, but I believe it's April 8th now, not the 1st. April 8th, we'll be redoing the Runbooks webinar. So if you missed the first one, if you're still new to Runbooks, we'll send that link out. You can register for that and you'll get a full deep dive into the Runbooks feature on April 8th. All right, Bob, thanks for the demo. Thanks for joining me today. We haven't done a webinar in a while, so that was fun.
Yeah, it's been quite a while since I last did a webinar.
All right. And then thanks again, everybody, for joining. Thanks for your questions. Again, if you have any follow-ups, advice@octopus.com, and we will see you at the next webinar.